Welcome to Transcendent. I'm Mark Roach. This is Chapter 2 of The Stranger. Dawn broke reluctantly over the city, its pale light struggling to compete with the electric symphony that never truly faded. The neon signs that pulsed through the night now looked garish and tired in the growing daylight, like party decorations the morning after celebration. Yet, something had shifted in the city's rhythm overnight, a subtle alteration in the frequency of its breathing, imperceptible to most, but unmistakable to those who knew how to listen. Joe Martinez stood at the window of his third-floor apartment, coffee mug warming his hands, watching the street below come alive with the morning's first commuters. He'd been awake since 4, not from insomnia, but from something else, a restlessness that felt less like anxiety and more like anticipation, as if his body knew something that his mind hadn't yet grasped. The coffee tasted different this morning, not better or worse exactly, but more present somehow, each sip carrying the full weight of its origin story, the soil and the rain and the human hands that brought the beans from some distant mountain to this moment, this cup, this awakening awareness that something fundamental had changed overnight. Joe worked the morning shift at Meridian Cafe, a narrow slice of warmth wedged between a defunct bookstore and a check cashing service. The cafe catered to the early risers and night shift workers, the insomniacs, and the intentionally wakeful, serving coffee that was honest about its bitterness and pastries that didn't pretend to be anything other than comfort food for the soul. He walked to work through the streets that were still slick with overnight rain. Joe found himself noticing things he usually overlooked. The way the puddles reflected fragments of the sky, turning the sidewalks into scattered portals to heaven. The intricate patterns of rust and wear on the fire escapes that zigzagged up the sides of older buildings like metallic vines. The small garden that Mrs. Chen had somehow coaxed to life in the narrow strip of soil between her apartment building and the street. Tomatoes and basil somehow with the purple flowers that he'd never learned to name. The changes were subtle but persistent. A street musician was setting up the corner of Main and 3rd, the same spot where someone had chalked an elaborate mandala the night before. The chalk was gone now, washed away by rain or swept up by city maintenance, but something of its essence lingered. The musician, a young woman with silver hair and hands that moved like birds, was tuning a guitar that sounded like it had stories to tell. Joe paused, something pulling his attention. There on the bench, where the street musician had placed her case, was a small origami bird, paper white, as fresh as snow, folded with such precision that it seemed to hover over the edge of flight. He'd seen the musician place her case there, but he was certain the paper bird hadn't been there moments before. "Excuse me," he called to the musician, "did you make that?" She looked up from her tuning, following his gaze to the origami crane. Her eyes widened slightly and she shook her head. "No, but I'm glad it's there. It feels like a good omen." Joe nodded, though he wasn't sure why. He started to walk away, and then he turned back. "What's your name?" "Maya," she said, offering a smile that seemed to hold more warmth than the morning sun. "Maya Celeste Wynn." Joe Martinez. I work at Meridian Cafe just down the street, down the block. Stop by later if you want. First coffee is on the house for anyone brave enough to make music on the street this early. I might do that, Maya said, her fingers finding a chord that resonated through the morning air like a question mark made by the sound. The Meridian Cafe was already humming with its usual cast of regulars when Joe arrived. There was Alana Vasquez, the research scientist from the university, hunched over her laptop with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, lost in whatever data stream she was navigating. At the corner table, Leo Brennan sketched in a notebook, his artist eye capturing the small dramas that played out amongst the cafe's morning clientele. But it was Tariq Hassan who first noticed that something was different about Joe this morning, or that morning. He looked like someone who just remembered something important, Tariq observed, looking up from his own notebook where he'd been scribbling what appeared to be comedy routines. Tariq had the comedian's gift for reading faces, for detecting the subtle shifts in mood and energy that most people missed. Do I? Joe considered this as he tied his apron and began the morning ritual of preparing the espresso machine. I feel more awake. I guess like I've been sleepwalking and just opened my eyes. Well, that's either the beginning of enlightenment or a nervous breakdown, Tariq said with a grin. Want me to hang around and find out which? Well, before Joe could answer, the bell above the door chimed and the morning took an unexpected turn. The man who entered was unremarkable in the way that truly remarkable things often are. Medium height, weathered coat, boots that had covered considerable ground. But there was something about his presence that seemed to shift the cafe's atmosphere, as if he carried with him a pocket of different air, charged with possibilities. He approached the counter with unhurried steps, his eyes taking in the details of the space, the mismatched chairs, the bulletin board covered with local announcements and amateur poetry, the espresso machine that wheezed like an old dog but still produced excellent coffee. Good morning, he said to Joe, and his voice carried traces of many places, as if he'd learned to speak by listening to the world's conversations. Morning, Joe replied, and found himself paying attention to the word in a way that he'd never had before. Morning, the morning of night, the birth of day, the daily resurrection of light and possibility. What can I get you? Coffee, the stranger said simply. However you think it should be made. It was an unusual request. Most customers arrived with specific requirements: extra hot, half calf, oat milk, 2 sugars, hold the phone. But this man was asking Joe to make a decision, to exercise judgment, to participate in the creation rather than simply fulfilling an order. Joe found himself approaching the task with unusual care. He selected beans that had been roasted locally, ground them to a consistency that felt right for the morning's humidity, pulled a shot that emerged from the pot, a filter like liquid amber. The milk he steamed to exactly the temperature where sweetness bloomed without the proteins curdling, creating foam that was dense but not heavy, textured but not stiff. As he worked, he became aware that the entire cafe had grown quieter, as if everyone was unconsciously listening to the small symphony of preparation. Even Elena had looked up from her laptop, watching the ritual of coffee creation with the same attention she usually reserved for her research data. That's beautiful work, the stranger said when Joe placed the cup before him. He lifted it with both hands. Inhaling the aroma before taking a sip, he closed his eyes for a moment, and then when they opened again, there was something like recognition in them. Yes, this is exactly how it should taste. You say that like you knew before you tried it, Joe observed. In a way, I did. Coffee like this carries the intention of a person who makes it. You make this cup with attention, with care, with presence. I could taste that before the coffee ever touched my lips. Tariq had been listening from his corner table, and now he approached the counter with the curiosity that made him a successful comedian. The ability to spot the unusual and draw it out into the light. You're not from around here, Tariq said. It wasn't quite a question. No, the stranger agreed, though I'm not sure anyone is truly from anywhere. We're all travelers. Some of us just haven't realized we're on a journey. That sounds like the setup for either a philosophy lecture or a really good joke, Tariq said. I'm hoping for the joke. The stranger smiled, and the expression transformed his entire face, revealing depths of amusement that suggested he found the universe itself perpetually entertaining. Why not both? The best philosophy is often indistinguishable from comedy, and the deepest jokes reveal truths that can't be expressed any other way. Alina had been drawn into the conversation despite herself, her scientist mind intrigued by the stranger's casual confidence. She approached the counter with her empty cup, ostensibly for a refill, but really to satisfy her curiosity. That's an interesting theory, she said, but how do you test it? How do you distinguish between profound jokes and mere nonsense? By their effects, the stranger said immediately. The true joke, one that carries real wisdom, doesn't just make you laugh, it makes you see something differently. It shifts your perspective just enough that the world looks slightly new when the laughter fades. Leo had been sketching during this entire exchange, his artist eye capturing not just the faces and the gestures, but the quality of attention that seemed to radiate from the stranger like heat from a fire. Now he closed his notebook and joined the growing circle around the counter. I've been drawing people for years, Leo said, and I've never seen anyone who looks quite like you. Not your features. Those are ordinary enough, but there's something in your expression, like you're seeing jokes that the rest of us are missing. Or like you're awake in a room full of dreamers, Maya added, appearing in the doorway with her guitar case slung over her shoulder. She'd been drawn by the music of the conversation, the way voices harmonized when people were truly listening to each other. The stranger turned to look at Maya, and for a moment recognition flickered between them. Not the recognition of the prior meeting, but of something deeper, as if they shared membership in some invisible organization whose purpose was only just becoming clear. Ah, the stranger said softly, the musician, I wondered when you would arrive. You were expecting me, Maya asked, settling her guitar case against the wall and accepting the cup of coffee that Joe had already begun preparing for her. I was expecting all of you, the stranger said, his gaze moving around the circle that had formed naturally around the counter. Though perhaps expecting is the wrong word. Hoping might be more accurate. Or simply trusting that when the time was right, those who were ready would find their way here. Ready for what? Elena asked. Her scientist training demanded specificity. To wake up, the stranger said simply. To remember what you already know but have forgotten. to begin the work you came here to do. Tariq laughed, but it wasn't dismissive laughter. It was the sound of someone recognizing a familiar rhythm. Okay, I'll bite. What work? And who says we forgot anything? The stranger reached into his coat and withdrew a small notebook, its leather cover worn smooth by countless hands. He opened it to a page covered with symbols that seemed to shift and dance when viewed directly. Watch the people outside, he said quietly. Really watch them. Not their clothes or their faces, but their quality of attention. Notice how they move through the world. Almost involuntarily, the group turned towards the cafe's large front window. The morning rush was in full swing now. Streams of people flowing along the sidewalks like schools of fish, following invisible currents. But as they watched with focused attention, the stranger had requested patterns began to emerge. Most of the pedestrians moved with their eyes fixed on screens, their attention divided between physical world and whatever digital realm they were navigating. Their movements were automatic, following routes they had walked thousands of times with conscious awareness, without conscious awareness. They stepped around obstacles, avoided collisions, stopped at crosswalks, all while their minds were elsewhere, lost in the endless stream of information, entertainment, and distraction that flowed through their devices. "They're sleepwalking," Maya whispered, and her voice carried a note of recognition that surprised her. Not literally, Elena said, but her scientific objectivity was warring with something else. A growing sense that Maya was right in ways that couldn't be measured with instruments. "No, not literally," the stranger agreed. "But when was the last time any of you walked down a street and truly saw where you were? When did you last eat a meal and taste every bite? When did you last have a conversation where you listened, not just to the words, but to the silence between them?" The questions hung in the air like challenges, and each member of the group found themselves confronting their own habits, their own patterns of automatic living. Leo was the first to speak. "I draw people all the time, but I realize I'm usually drawing types, not individuals. The businessman, the student, the jogger. I've stopped seeing the person inside the category. I analyze data all day long," Elena added slowly, "but I haven't really looked at the night sky in months. I know the theory of stellar formation, but I've forgotten what it feels like to wonder at the actual stars." Tariq nodded. "I make jokes about everything, but I can't remember the last time I was genuinely surprised by anything. I've turned the whole world into material, but I've stopped letting it amaze me." "I play music," Maya said, "but I practice in my apartment and perform for tips on street corners. I've forgotten what it feels like to make music with other people, to create something together that none of us could make alone." Joe found himself at the last to speak. He said, and when he did this, his voice was quiet with realization. "I make coffee for people every day, but I don't really see them. They're just orders to fill, preferences to accommodate. I've turned into serving people, into serving orders." The stranger nodded, and there was compassion in his eyes, but also something else, a quality of the recognition that suggested he had been through this same awakening himself, perhaps many times. "This is how it begins," he said, "with recognition, with the admission that you have been asleep and the decision to wake up. But waking up is not a one-time event. It's a practice, a choice you make moment by moment, breath by breath. He closed his notebook and looked around the circle of faces, each now marked with a subtle change, a heightened alertness that hadn't been there when the morning began. I'm going to make you an offer, he said, not a promise, not a guarantee, but an invitation. If you're willing to pay attention, really pay attention to what's happening around you and inside you. If you're willing to question assumptions you've never thought to question, if you're willing to remember what it feels like to truly be alive in this moment, then I can show you things about this world and yourselves that will change everything. What kind of things, Elena asked, though her voice suggested she already suspected the answer would be both larger and smaller than anything she could imagine. The kind of things you already know, the stranger said with a smile, but have convinced yourselves you don't believe. Outside, the city continued this morning routine, streams of people flowing along familiar paths, following patterns established long ago and rarely questioned. But inside the Meridian Cafe, something new was beginning, a small awakening that would ripple outward in ways none of them could imagine. The stranger finished his coffee and placed the empty cup on the counter. "Thank you," he said to Joe. "That was exactly what I needed." He turned to go and then paused at the door. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, though it sounded more like a statement than a question. 5 voices answered as one, "Yes." After he left, the group remained standing outside the counter, none of them quite ready to turn to their usual routine. Something had shifted. Something invisible threshold had been crossed. And they all felt it, a sense of anticipation mixed with uncertainty, like actors who had just been handed a script for a play they'd never heard of, but somehow knew they were meant to perform. "Did that really just happen?" Leo asked, voicing what they were all thinking. "I think so," Maya replied, touching the origami bird that still sat on the windowsill where she had placed it after finding it on the street. "Though I'm not entirely sure what that was." "Research opportunity," Elena murmured. But her usual scientific detachment was already being replaced by something warmer, more personally engaged. "Material," Tariq said automatically, then caught himself. "No, more the material, something real." Joe was wiping down the counter with unusual care, each circular motion deliberate and present. "He never told us his name," he observed. "Does it matter?" Maya asked. "Some people are more than their names." Outside, the morning rush continued, but the 5 people inside the Meridian Cafe were no longer quite part of that stream. They stepped slightly outside the current into an eddy of possibility that would carry them toward shores they had never imagined. The invitation had been extended and accepted. Now the real journey could begin. As if summoned by some unspoken agreement, they began to gather their things more slowly than usual, reluctant to disperse back into their separate lives. The conversation continued in fragments, observations about the stranger, questions about his offer, tentative explorations of what it might mean to truly wake up. "I keep thinking about what he said about coffee," Joe said, running his hand through along the espresso machine. "About tasting the intention. I've been making drinks for 3 years, but this is the first time I've thought about what what I put into them besides ingredients. It's like photography, Leo said, but in reverse. Instead of capturing a moment, you're creating one. Every cup is a small work of art if you approach it that way. Elena was running calculations in her head, but not of the usual kind. If attention can be tasted, if intention can be transmitted through such simple interactions, then we're dealing with information transfer through channels we don't usually recognize. The implications are staggering. Or maybe, Tariq suggested, we're just overthinking a really good cup of coffee made by someone who cares about what he's doing. Why not both? Maya asked, echoing the stranger's earlier words. Maybe the profound and simple are the same thing, viewed from different angles. They stayed until the lunch rush began to build, reluctant to leave the space where their awakening had begun. But eventually, necessity scattered them back to their individual lives, Elena to her laboratory, Leo to his studio, Tariq to his day job at the bookstore, Maya to her afternoon busking spots around the city. But they carried with them something new, a quality of attention that made colors seem brighter, sounds seem distant, interactions more meaningful. The world hadn't changed overnight, but their way of seeing it had. And that made all the difference. As Joe worked through the afternoon shift, he found himself really looking at each customer, seeing not just their order preferences, but glimpses of their inner lives, the exhausted graduate student who needed caffeine and encouragement in equal measure, the elderly man who came in every day at 2 o'clock, not for the coffee, but for the human contact. The young mother who treated her brief escape to the cafe like a meditation retreat. Each interaction became an opportunity to practice what the stranger had demonstrated. Presence and attention, the art of being fully where you are when you're there. It was exhausting at first, this level of engagement, but also energizing in a way that Joe had never experienced. By closing time, he felt like he had worked harder than usual, but accomplished something more significant than serving drinks. He had participated in a series of small ceremonies, brief moments of genuine human connection that had left him and his customers subtly changed. As he locked up the cafe, Joe noticed that the origami bird was gone from the windowsill. In its place was a small card, no bigger than a business card, made of paper that seemed to shimmer with its own light. On it was printed a simple message: "Tomorrow brings new possibilities. Are you ready?" Joe pocketed the card and walked home through the streets that looked exactly the same as they had that morning, but felt completely different. The city hadn't changed, but he had begun to change, and that was making all the difference. In apartments and studios across the city, 4 other people were having similar experiences, carrying with them the memory of a morning that had shifted something fundamentally in their understanding of what it meant to be alive and awake in the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to practice the art of presence they had a glimpse of that morning. But tonight, for the first time and longer than any of them could remember, they would fall asleep, not with the weight of another day survived, but with the anticipation of another day truly lived. The stranger's invitation had taken root. Now it would begin to grow.